Delegates at the Africa and African Diaspora virtual conference will be discussing the effects of climate change amongst other topics. And Reverend James Bhagwan, who's the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, is one of the speakers. Reverend Bhagwan also attended the UN Climate Change Conference in Madrid in 2019, and he joins us now via Zoom. Reverend, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right. So COP26 is days away now. And I just wonder, from your part of the world, I know that oceans are a big issue for you. Africa has a lot of oceans on our coastlines on either side. And I just wonder what countries with oceans are concerned about when we talk about climate change and what needs to be put on the table at a big summit like COP26?
Well, we've been articulating the issue not just in terms of the impact on oceans, but what that means for coastal and low-lying atoll communities for over a decade now in the Pacific. And, in terms of ocean acidification, in terms of the death of phytoplankton, that's a global issue because the oceans are the blue lungs of the planet. They create more oxygen than you get from even the Amazon. But for communities that live by the sea, coastal communities, and those, as I mentioned, are low-lying coral atolls, we are already starting to see, as a result of the current changes, the current temperature and the current sea level rise, the impact that's placing on these communities who are now being either forced to relocate or at high risk to relocate. Now, the degrees that we talk about, 1.5, 2 degrees, and we've heard in the report earlier that it might be more than 2.5 degrees. These translate into centimeters and half meters and into meters. But for the low-lying communities, coastal communities, it doesn't take much. Just a few centimeters can mean the difference between living by the sea, living next to the sea, and living under the sea. And so we are already starting to see coastal communities, particularly in Fiji and in the Pacific, where I come from, preparing to move, and some have already started to move. And this is a real issue for us. And I wonder if that 100 billion is even going to be enough when we start to engage on climate-induced displacement and relocation.
You talk about relocation and migration. Are we seeing already people perhaps leaving the maritime sector completely and going inland and perhaps turning to other pastimes?
Well, it's important to recognize that in this day and age, there is really no unavailable land or abandoned land. Land in most of our communities, whether you're in Africa or in the Pacific, belongs to somebody. Now, for those on the coastal communities that have to relocate a little bit further inland, they may have the fortune of relocating to their own land. But what if that land belongs, the land that they have to relocate to belongs to another community or is freehold and belongs to someone else? What does that mean in terms of dispossession? And how do you translate from a community whose livelihood and whose identity and culture is based on the ocean having to translate inland? We've seen the challenges that this has placed in the past with forced relocation in some of our Pacific Island countries, and so we're very clear on what that will do. But then you also have atoll islands like Kiribati and Tuvalu, who, if they have to relocate, have nowhere in their own country to go. And that means not just internal migration, but international migration as well.
One issue that I know is important to you, and maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about it. At the moment, we hear about adaptation and mitigation and funding for those, but you're also concerned about funding for loss and damage as well.
Absolutely. And this is the issue. Adaptation and mitigation talks to how we live in the context of climate change, how we protect communities from sea level rise by seawalls, by infrastructure development, how we transition to cleaner economies and renewable energy, all that sort of thing, how we mitigate the situation. But what we're talking about here is when people lose their livelihoods because they have to move. What happens in the context of islands, for example, who lose their sovereignty because their landmass is underwater, or their exclusive economic zones shrink because they're determined by pieces of land that stick out in the ocean. And so when we talk about loss and damage, we're talking about the economic loss and damage that communities and countries will experience, but also talking about non-economic loss and damage. And this has to do with the cultural, mental, spiritual trauma that communities, many of whom are deeply connected to their land, spiritually connected to that land, that they will experience in the context of having to relocate as a result of climate-induced displacement.
What are you hoping will come out then of this Africa and Africa Diaspora Conference, this virtual summit that's taking place, particularly around climate change, so close to COP26? What do you want Africans and Africans in the diaspora to do?
Well, I think in this context, we need to recognize that when we talk about the African diaspora, we also talk in the context of people who have been displaced, who have gone through that process of disconnection, of alienation. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, and maybe lessons that we can learn, and for them to advocate for those now at risk as a result of climate change, and to add their voice to the issue of climate justice. But when we talk about also the issue of migration, we already have people, migrant workers, people of African descent. We also have members of the African diaspora who are migrant workers, and we're going to see a lot more of this. And so we need to recognize the issue of maintaining dignity, the safety and security of people who will be moving into these spaces. And really, this is the call for everyone to come together, whether they are of African descent, whether they are of Pacific Island descent, and recognize that this is a time for us to speak for each other, to recognize that, one community can speak to another community, that Africa can speak for the Pacific, and the Pacific can speak for Africa, to the negotiations that are taking place in the next 2 weeks in Glasgow. And this has to happen now.
So you were in Madrid, 2019. We're in Glasgow now, and I just wonder, from your experience at Madrid, how optimistic are you that, this isn't going to be just another COP?
It's lucky I'm a pastor, because it's my faith that gives me hope. Really, it's not optimism. I am really quite looking pragmatically. Unless the talk becomes walk, as we say, unless those, as we heard in the report earlier, those nationally determined contributions are real, unless we shift away from what Greta Thunberg calls the blah, blah rhetoric that we hear at every COP, this planet is heading for some serious problems. And that's not just for people, that's for the environment, that's for generations to come. And we need nothing less than our leaders to be willing to sacrifice their political future for the sake of the planet. And, I challenge our world leaders to show their mettle by being willing to risk their political capital for the sake of the planet. If it's just rhetoric, if it doesn't translate into on the ground in our countries, nothing's going to change. And those who are vulnerable are going to be more vulnerable and more marginalized.
The superpowers have been controlling the world through instruments like the Security Council, and it doesn't matter sometimes what the rest of the world thinks. COP26 should be equal voice, equal power, equal thought, equal contribution. But do you get a sense that the developed nations, Africa and your region as well, where smaller nations perhaps don't always get the voice that they need, will you get that at COP26?
I think it's not a matter of whether we'll get it. I think it's a matter of us demanding it. The time for political niceties is over. And our so-called developing countries are used to punching above their weight. And this is that kind of battle. Now, we're hampered at the moment because of COVID-19. And so, while it's important that this meeting goes ahead, we recognize that many Pacific Island countries, many African countries perhaps as well, and other developing nations may not be able to send their negotiators, may not even be able to be represented because of the challenges of COVID-19. And while the UK government has done their best to open it up, to make it accessible, even for some people to get out of their countries, to get to COP is a major challenge in itself. And so the challenge is now for those who are there to make sure that they advocate for those who cannot be there. And, as I said, and we've always heard this, there is no plan B, there is no planet B. Maybe the 2% can fly to Mars, but the rest of us cannot do that. And so, whatever is happening in the context of climate change, we in the Pacific, those on the coastal areas of Africa, and those who experience the extreme weather patterns of floods and droughts and tropical cyclones, etc., we are the ones who are experiencing it now. But I guarantee you, this is not going to be just for us. This is something that is going to impact every man, woman, and child on this planet. And so it's the responsibility of every country and every community and every voter in those countries to ensure that their governments step up.
All right, and perhaps as a final question, just to look at the human side again of this, as a man of God and one that attends to the needs of your flock, I just wonder what the psychological impact and traumas that people have to face dealing with some of the issues of the disruption caused by climate change.
That is the real issue at the end of the day. Yes, we face the physical issues, but physical issues can sometimes be, adapted to and mitigated, as I said. But the real issue that we face, and we see this when we go and visit those communities who are affected, who are being displaced and being relocated, and this is where we say non-economic loss and damage, because these people are being literally uprooted from their land and taken to a place that is not their own. In our Pacific communities, when a child is born, usually the umbilical cord that's left at birth when it falls off, that is buried with a coconut tree or some kind of seedling, to indicate that person's connection with the land. And those are serious, deep spiritual connections. So you can imagine the trauma of leaving behind this place that not only is your home, but you are intrinsically connected with. People having to leave behind the cemeteries of where their loved ones are buried. People who are having to move to places where their way of life is going to be completely different. How do you encourage people to have hope in those situations? And this is where we as faith communities are working with our communities, engaging with them to try and shift that, what feels like complete alienation, what feels like exile, at least into some sort of exodus, so that there is some sense of promise at the end that things will get better. But that will only happen if we are supported by the polluting countries and by those who are needing to make these important decisions and make and keep those commitments to climate financing, to loss and damage, and the other issues at COP. So this is not an issue of states negotiating at COP. This is not an issue of big commitments by superstars and superpowers. This is an issue of men, women, and children being uprooted, taken to a place, and they have in many occasions, no right of return, because that place that was their home, when a conflict situation you can go back to, that place simply no longer exists.
Reverend James Bhagwan, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very, very much indeed for your insights on this burning issue that we need to find solutions for urgently. Thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Okay, and that's where we'll leave our conversation with the General Secretary of the Pacific Conference of Churches, Reverend James Bhagwan, speaking to us ahead of COP26, but also in the midst of the African and Pan-African and Africans in the Diaspora conference, which is taking place at the moment. And one of the key issues being discussed is climate change and how it's affecting our continents and the world at large.